I'm here on the grounds of the Quinta San Pedro Alejandrino in Santa Marta, Colombia, and this is the place where Simón Bolívar died. He died of tuberculosis. There's some speculation that he might have died of arsenic poisoning or a fungal infection or something like that, but the prevailing view is that it was of tuberculosis. He died in 1830. He was born in 1783. He was born in Caracas, Venezuela. He's Venezuelan. Venezuela did not exist yet. It was a Spanish colony. He was a criollo, Creole, meaning that he was of Spanish descent, but was born here in the Americas. And he is known as the Liberator, as the person who, it's way more complicated than it just being one person. There were lots of different people who fought for liberty from the Spanish. And that's a movement that he did not invent, but he certainly became a leader of. The countries that we have today that sort of owe their legacy in part to him would be Colombia, where we are now, would be Venezuela, where he's from, would be Panama, which at the time was part of Colombia. It was called Nueva Granada, and it started, of course, as a Spanish colony. Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Now, Bolivar, along with other people like Francisco de Paula Santander, Paez, for example, in Venezuela, were all people that had the idea of freeing themselves from the Spanish. Now, just like it wouldn't be correct to say George Washington was the guy who came up with the idea of American independence from England, it would not be correct to say that Bolivar came up with the idea of independence from Spain. But anyway, he was a consensus leader of that movement in the northern part of South America. You also had independent movements in the southern cone, as they say today, places like Chile and Argentina. San Martin from Argentina was another liberating hero, if you will. But the interesting thing about Simón Bolívar that I wanted to bring up, and a lot of people, if you're down here in South America, you'll see statues named after Simón Bolívar. You'll see parks named after him. I used to live in a neighborhood that was called Simón Bolívar. And you cannot take away from the importance or the impact of what he did. He was born to a family that owned slaves, but he actually became an abolitionist and then also used that in the fight against Spain. It was interesting because Spain then also sort of became abolitionists, trying to get the former slaves to fight on their side. So it was like, we want to free you, we want to free you. It's interesting things that happened back then. But Bolivar there was sort of a contradiction, because he wanted liberty for the Americas. He wanted independence. And this was in the early 1800s. So it was after the French Revolution. It was after the U.S. had already broke away from England and established itself. Bolivar spent some time in Europe, traveling throughout France, traveling throughout Italy and Spain, of course, and picked up Enlightenment ideas. Later on, he not only traveled to the U.S., but he traveled to places in the Caribbean like Jamaica and Haiti. He actually got strong support from the post-revolutionary Haitian leaders. So the Haitian leaders were like, if you're going to go and free the slaves and kick out the Europeans in South America, then we support you. And Haiti actually armed and funded Bolivar to a certain extent. And so they became a very early ally of let's call it the Bolivarian Revolution, even though that term isn't exactly accurate, because again, revolution was already breaking out and he became a leader of it, but it wouldn't be fair to say that he was the founder or anything like that. Now, Bolivar wanted to have a strong central government, which ended up being at the time in Bogota, in what was now Colombia, but at the time was called Nueva Granada. And he went and got liberty and with his compatriots in places like obviously Venezuela and places like Peru and Ecuador and things like that. But he wanted all of these places to be ruled by a central government in Bogota. The problem, and this problem really still exists today, it's hard to have that central government influencing things way out in the hinterlands. If it's bad enough, if Colombia still faces those challenges today, even at that time when there wasn't a road network that would connect these different far-flung places, even up into the 1800s, or we're talking about the 1800s, even up until the 1900s, it was difficult to get from, let's say, Medellin to Bogota, let alone places like the outside departments like Choco or even up here where we were on the coast. To get up here on the coast, you would come up and down the Magdalena River. There wasn't so much of a road network back then. And the people in Ecuador, the people in Peru, really had no connection to Bogota. They might have wanted to be free from Spain, but they didn't want freedom from Spain to be ruled by Bogota. And at the time, that was like Mars to them. Most of them had never been to Colombia, let alone to the capital. And so there was not a lot of support for this big vision of a central government that Simón Bolívar wanted. And beyond that, Bolívar kind of felt like the people in Latin America, or the people in South America, to be more specific, were not necessarily ready for a participatory democracy. His idea, according to him, was yes, democracy is a good idea, but these people, in his mind, and he's used some kind of words like this, are their children, or they're not ready for that. And so we need to have a strong leader. And so he had the idea that he wanted to be like president for life. And you could call that a dictator if you want to. It certainly is a caudillo, a strongman. And he had the idea that you needed this strong leader. He didn't want a monarchy. He was actually anti-monarchist. He was against the idea of having any kind of kings or royalty or anything like that. But he wanted to have a strong central leader, a strong president who could do a lot of things by decree. He had a lot of opposition to that, primarily led by Francisco de Paula Santander. Santander at the time was the vice president of Colombia. Bolivar had been elected. This is after the revolution, and they kicked the Spanish out and things like that. But Santander was very much a Republican, and I use that in the technical sense. I don't mean Republican like the Republican Party today in the U.S., but he wanted a nation of laws. He wanted a nation where the laws were supreme, not men, not strong personalities. And the idea was that this is law, good or bad, we're going to have a representative democracy and people are going to vote on things. Another dimension to that was the idea of having a, let's say, distributed type of a federalist government like we have in the U.S., where you have these different states and the states have a large degree of autonomy and self-rule. In the U.S., most of your laws are actually made at the state level. Most of your crimes, like if you were to go and do some violence or something like that to someone, those tend to be state crimes. States can levy their own taxes. They can set up their own different forms of government and such. And so Santander was kind of the leader of the Republican movement, the idea of having strong laws, not strongmen, okay? And it came to a head eventually to where there's debate as to whether Santander himself was directly involved, but at the very least, he probably was complicit. The Septembrino conspiracy, where they went to go and there's some people tried to basically kill Simón Bolívar when he was in Bogota, because they were afraid that he was taking on too much power. It almost has echoes of the whole thing with Julius Caesar and the Republic was in peril, and so we've got to kill this guy because he's going to become an emperor. By killing Caesar, they actually bought into existence, and of course it's more complicated than that, but the Roman Republic died and the Roman Empire began. So Bolivar, they were unsuccessful. They were not able to to get to him. A very interesting story behind that I'll tell at some point. He became very bitter and paranoid. After that, he already, it seems to be, was suffering from tuberculosis, and a short time after that, 3 years later, ends up here in La Quinta here in Santa Marta, where he spent his final days. One of the ironies is that this place was owned by a Spaniard who was a supporter of Bolivar and a sympathizer with him, and provided him with a safe place to rest and hopefully recuperate, but he ended up spending his final days here. So I certainly encourage you to visit if you're ever in Santa Marta. It's a beautiful, it's now like a park and museum. The properties are still here. I don't know how much they've been renovated. I mean, I can certainly tell that they have to some degree, but it's very inexpensive if you want to visit. It costs $24,000 pesos, which is not $24. That's about $5, something like that. If you're Colombian, or 30,000 pesos, again, just a few bucks if you are a foreigner. They have guides, they have free guides. Some of the guides, I believe, are bilingual as well and can support you in at least English and Spanish, if not other languages. But certainly you want to look at not just the history of Simón Bolívar, but what it means today. What we still have today is this tug of war between these strong, charismatic types of leaders. And this isn't just here in Latin America, but really throughout the world. We see this tug of war happening in the United States, where you have this big populist guy or this big charismatic guy comes in, usually guys. I suppose it could be women. I suppose Margaret Thatcher had a strong personality like that as well, right? But it's a tug of war between that caudillo, that strongman, that strong coercive personality, and the idea of a republic, the idea of having a nation of laws where not any one person can get so much power. And then also you have the central government versus the idea of local rule, or at least states and things like that. So anyway, they throw out the Spanish and they create this Gran Colombia thing, which was supposed to be this amalgamation of all these different former Spanish colonies. And one of the important things to realize is that Spain, when it had colonial rule, unlike the U.S., did not let the colonies talk to each other. So if you were, let's say in Nueva Granada, if you were in what's now Colombia, you couldn't just, I'm going to go across the border to Venezuela and just do business with them or something like that. That could get you killed, because the Spanish, with that mercantilistic type of economy, wanted everything to go back to Spain, to King Carlos and to those guys, because the whole idea of having the colonies was to feed the Spanish crown. So the result of that was that, one, there was no real impulse to industry. It wasn't like where in England you had the Industrial Revolution happening and people were making these factories and things like that, and then people in the U.S., what's now the U.S., were saying, hey, we're growing this cotton and stuff like that. We ought to make our own factories here. There was no real, even after the Spanish were taken out, there was no real impetus at the beginning to create an industrial sector, or to bring in risk capital and these types of things. And so that held all of Latin America back, but especially down here in South America, where things remained sort of a agricultural economy based on plantations and crops and things like that. Sort of like how in the U.S. you had the tension between the industrialized North and the agricultural South. The same thing, well, there wasn't even a tension because there was no industrialized sector to create any kind of tension with. And so that's one of the ingredients into why South America, especially this part of South America, was so slow to develop. But anyway, so Bolivar goes with not just him, but the whole armies and all the other compatriots and things like that. And they go and free what's now Ecuador. They free what's now Peru. They free what's now Bolivia. At the times, these places didn't quite yet exist as concepts. You had viceroyalties, and you had some of you could see on a map, because maybe the countries follow the whole Spanish way, that Spanish divided up the colonies administratively. But then the dream of this Gran Colombia fell apart because the people in Peru didn't have anything in common with the people in not just Colombia, but let alone Bogota. It's hard enough, like I mentioned, for let's say Bogota and Cartagena and Santa Marta and Medellin, which didn't really exist yet, to hold things together. So let alone when you're going to try to bring in Peru, right? Very few people had ever even been to both places. And so that fell apart relatively quickly. And we end up, long story short, all of these things could be their own episodes or their own series of episodes. The story of San Martin out of Argentina is fascinating. He and Bolivar actually met in Peru. But anyway, it's an interesting tension. I wanted to take advantage of the time here to give you a little bit of the history of Simón Bolívar, but also importantly is that conflicts that existed then still exist today. They still exist in the tension between a strong centralized government and a distributed federalist government, between the strongman, charismatic, caudillo, tough guy ruler who's going to rule just by sheer force of personality and by decree. In Colombia, you see he's been really thwarted by it, but Gustavo Petro, the current president, thought that he was going to come in and be like Bolivar and rule by decree and just remake everything. But Colombia has enough institutionalism to put a stop to that, and he wasn't ever able to accomplish those dreams that he has had and that he still has of kind of remaking the whole country's political structure and economic structure. That hasn't worked because he has the tendency of wanting to be a strong man. And Colombia, enough people in Colombia have more of a Republican mentality of wanting to have strong institutions. On the other hand, in Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez took over power, he changed the name of the country to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. One, because he understood the psychological aspect of picking some dead statesman and making him the hero, because the dead guy can't come back to contradict and to say, no, that's not what I thought, that's not what I believe. But also because what he wanted to do and what he was successful in doing in Venezuela was to create a strongman type of government where you have a strong personality. In that case, it was Hugo Chavez, to be able to just rule by force of personality, to overrun the court system, to overrun the Congress, and kind of be basically a dictator for life, which is really what he did. What he was able to do is exactly what Bolivar wanted to do. Now, I'm not saying that Bolivar had anything to do with socialism or any kind of thing like that. I'm not saying that Bolivar would approve of Chavez. I doubt it, but I don't know. That might be just my own bias. But anyway, that is what we have seen, where just looking at that contradiction between Colombia, where it's more of a Republican rule of law kind of place, and Venezuela, where it's been a rule of personality place. We can see those tensions play out right there. So tell me what you think. Did you know who Simón Bolívar was? What would you like us to cover next? What do you believe about this tension? What's more important, that tension between a distributed federalist government and a strong central government? Or is it more important to talk about the strong leader? Which one do you prefer, the strong leader, the charismatic leader, or a rule of law kind of place where the republic is most important, let's say the Constitution or the institutions are more important than any strong guy, tough guy, John Wayne type of leader? Let me know what you think, and thanks a lot.